I caught her red-handed the third time she broke into my garage. Middle of the day, broad sunlight, wearing those ridiculous oversized sunglasses and her HOA badge like she's on the FBI's most entitled list. Her name? Beverly Tinsley. President of the Moss Ridge Estates HOA and the self-proclaimed moral compass of our cul-de-sac. She called herself a pillar of the community. I called her what she was: a nosy, power-drunk, middle-aged tyrant with too much time and too many printed bylaws. The first time it happened, I thought maybe I had left the garage door open. It's an old thing, creaks like a haunted barn gate and takes a solid 2 minutes to shut. I figured I was distracted. Maybe I hit the button and drove off before it closed. But when I came home from work and noticed some of my tools were rearranged, my socket set moved, a box of screws opened, I started getting suspicious. The second time, I was sure I had closed it. I even watched it go down all the way before heading out to pick up groceries. Came back an hour later and found the side door cracked open. That door's got a lock. A real one. Not one of those cheap twisty knobs. I checked the lock. Scratched. Tampered. So the third time I set up a trail cam. The kind of motion-activated camera hunters use for spotting deer. I tucked it behind the rake on the shelf, pointed it straight at the side door. That night, I reviewed the footage. There she was. Beverly. In her full Karen glory. Clipboard tucked under her arm, using a key that looked suspiciously like it had been copied, and letting herself in. She scurried around like a raccoon in a pantry, snapping pictures of my shelves, sniffing near a gas can like she was a bomb tech, then left 30 minutes later. I called the HOA office the next morning, asking why the president was breaking into my property. They denied it. Said Beverly was conducting a routine visual inspection per the HOA's safety clause. I asked where in the bylaws it said you could enter someone's locked garage without permission. They hung up. So I drove down to the HOA office in person, slapped a printed still shot of Beverly inside my garage on the front desk, and asked again loud enough for the other residents in the waiting area to hear. "This is criminal trespass," I said. "And I'm pressing charges." The lady behind the counter, some junior HOA lackey, blinked at the photo like it was a magic eye puzzle and stammered. "Mr. O'Hara, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. Beverly's only doing her duty." "My duty is to protect my property," I snapped. "Next time she steps foot in my garage, she's leaving in cuffs." I left, furious. But I also knew the HOA had friends in the city code office. If I went to the cops without a smoking gun and a whole documentary's worth of proof, they'd find a way to spin it. Claim I was the problem. The HOA always protected its own. So I got creative. See, I worked nights at the hospital. Respiratory therapist. 12-hour shifts for days a week. Which meant Beverly thought she had free reign during the daytime. I figured if I couldn't stop her with warnings, I'd stop her with something less welcoming. Cue the Skunks. Not just one. 5. I met a guy named Felix through a coworker. Wildlife control expert who'd gotten fired from a city job for releasing possums in a judge's pool house. My kind of guy. For a modest fee and a case of cold ones, he agreed to live trap a handful of skunks and deliver them discreetly to my garage. Midnight rolled around. I had the garage prep tarp over the floor, small dishes of tuna bait to keep them calm, a couple of discreet holes drilled near the baseboards for fresh air. Felix pulled up in an old Ford van that looked like it belonged on an FBI watch list. Inside, 5 very awake, very annoyed skunks. "You sure about this?" he asked, holding the first cage like it was a box of TNT. "If she comes in again," I said, "she's gonna meet the welcoming committee." We positioned the cages carefully, gave them space, set a camera in the corner, and locked up tight. I left the side door unlocked this time just to make sure Beverly didn't have to work too hard. Next afternoon, while I was at work, the motion alert pinged my phone. I checked the feed on my break. There she was, clipboard in one hand, gloved fingers on the doorknob. She stepped inside, clearly expecting to snoop around again. And then it happened. One of the skunks must have felt cornered. I didn't see it spray, but I sure saw Beverly bolt out of there like she was on fire. She hit the lawn face first, gagging and clutching her mouth. The camera caught everything, her coughing, crawling, screaming into her phone. She even ripped off her cardigan and threw it into the bushes like it had betrayed her. I laughed so hard I nearly knocked over the ventilator cart. By the time I got home, animal control had come and gone. The skunks were safely removed. No harm done. I opened the garage with gloves and a gas mask, tossed the tarp, and aired it out for a week. Not ideal, but worth it. The smell lingered for a while, but the memory of Beverly's shriek every time I opened the footage made it all worthwhile. 2 days later, I got a letter taped to my front door. Official HOA letterhead. Words like biological hazard, reckless endangerment, and sanctions were thrown around like confetti. They accused me of setting a trap, called it malicious entrapment, said I was violating at least 6 articles of the Neighborhood Behavior Code. I wrote one sentence on a sticky note and taped it over the letter. Stop trespassing. Then I printed out a second photo, this one of Beverly mid-sprint, cardigan half off, a skunk in the background, and mailed it to every member of the HOA board. Turns out that was just the beginning. 3 days after the skunk incident, a manila envelope showed up in my mailbox. No postage, no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in blocky, impatient handwriting. Inside were 7 sheets of paper, a formal notice of violation, a proposed fine totaling over $1,300, and a threatening clause about potential lien placement for noncompliance. At the bottom was Beverly's signature, etched so deep into the paper I could feel the pressure marks with my thumb. What stood out wasn't the absurd amount or the manufactured hazardous wildlife claim, it was the final paragraph. It stated that a unanimous vote of emergency authority had been passed by the HOA board to grant Beverly temporary enforcement privileges to investigate emerging threats to community safety. In plain English, they'd given her the green light to snoop into private property without notice. Retroactively. As if that would magically legalize her trespassing. I took the packet to my neighbor across the street, Martin Ruiz, who ran a small law office downtown. He was a quiet guy, always wore sandals even in winter, but he knew his way around property law like a bloodhound in a courtroom. She's trying to build a paper shield around what she did, Martin said, flipping through the pages. The language here is intentionally vague and full of legal-sounding fluff. There's no actual statute cited. No municipal codes. Just HOA jargon. Can they even do this? I asked. Not unless you let them. I asked him what he meant. HOAs are like vampires, he said. They need permission to come in. You start accepting these letters as legitimate, paying their fake fines, you give them precedent. But the second you push back with actual legal firepower, they scatter. I asked him if he could help me push back. He set the packet down and said, "Oh, I've been waiting for this for years." The next morning, Martin filed an official cease and desist letter against the HOA, citing unlawful entry, harassment, and attempted fraud. He attached stills from the garage camera, a copy of my garage door locks repair invoice, and a notarized statement from Felix confirming that the skunks had been contained, fed, and never released intentionally. We mailed it certified to every board member, the HOA's legal counsel, and the city registrar. That alone would have rattled them. But Martin didn't stop there. He filed a complaint with the county clerk requesting a full audit of the HOA's past 6 months of spending and board meeting minutes. He dug up a provision in the original Moss Ridge Estates development charter that required all emergency resolutions to be recorded with the county within 72 hours if they involved homeowner property access. No such record existed. That's when things started to unravel. The following Tuesday, someone spray-painted fumigator in red across my garage door. I found it before sunrise, just as I was heading out for my shift. I called the police and filed a vandalism report. The responding officer, a younger guy named Torres, took one look at the footage I pulled from my doorbell cam and let out a slow whistle. "Is that the HOA president?" he asked, pausing the video on Beverly's unmistakable silhouette, hoodie pulled tight, can of spray paint in hand. "Sure is." Torres called it in and told me to hang tight. Later that afternoon, 2 detectives showed up with an official warrant to search Beverly's home for evidence of trespassing, vandalism, and illegal surveillance. Turns out, Beverly had been recording more than just my garage. She had a setup in her own home, several drives full of footage she'd captured from a hacked network of outdoor cameras around the neighborhood. She'd been piggybacking on unsecured Wi-Fi routers to spy on residents' driveways, backyards, and even some windows. One folder on her desktop was labeled Non-Compliance Evidence. Inside were hundreds of screenshots. Trash cans left out too long. Grass that hadn't been edged. A child's inflatable pool in a side yard. When word got out, it spread like wildfire. A dozen neighbors, some of whom had supported the HOA for years, showed up at my door asking if the rumors were true. I didn't have to say much. I just played the video of Beverly in my garage, followed by a still image from the vandalism footage. By the time I was done, people looked like they'd just walked out of a horror movie. One of them, an older woman named May, started tearing up. "She fined me for having a bird feeder," she said, voice shaking. $65. Said it attracted rodents. I thought I was going crazy. That night, Martin organized a town hall meeting at the local community center. Word spread fast. Over 70 people showed up, more than half the neighborhood. Martin brought copies of the cease and desist letter and a printout of the HOA charter. He highlighted every clause Beverly had violated, from unauthorized surveillance to misuse of funds. Then he dropped the bombshell. She's been using HOA dues to reimburse herself for investigative expenses. Over $4,000 in the last 3 months. Gas mileage, printing, even a new camera lens. The room exploded. People shouted. Someone near the back yelled that they'd been fined for a cracked sidewalk, even though it was city property. Another said their kid's lemonade stand had triggered a commercial activity violation. Martin raised his hand. "The HOA isn't untouchable," he said. "You have the right to call a vote to dissolve it, or at the very least remove the current board. But you need signatures." 60% of homeowners. I offered to go door to door that weekend. So did a dozen others. Martin printed the petitions. By Sunday afternoon, we had over 75%. The following Monday, we served the board with a formal recall notice. Beverly tried to stall the meeting, claimed it violated some procedural rule about quarterly scheduling. Martin calmly handed her a printed copy of the State Homeowners Act, which allowed for emergency recall votes if the board was found in breach of fiduciary duty. The vote was held 2 days later in the community clubhouse. The turnout was massive. Beverly showed up in sunglasses again, flanked by 2 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She tried to speak, but the crowd booed her into silence. When the ballots were counted, the verdict was clear: she was out. So were the other 2 board members who had backed her. The remaining seats would be filled by interim volunteers until a permanent election could be held. As Beverly stormed out, someone tossed a copy of the HOA charter into her open car window. It landed with a soft thud on the passenger seat. She didn't even look back. That night, I cleaned the last of the red spray paint off my garage door with a bottle of graffiti remover and a sponge. The scent of skunk had finally faded, replaced by the crisp smell of citrus cleaner and the faintest trace of pine. I stood in the driveway, sipping a lukewarm beer, watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes past without fear of arbitrary fines or clipboard inspections. Porch lights flicked on one by one. Lawns were mowed, but not obsessively. A garden gnome peeked proudly from a flower bed. Felt like a neighborhood again. And as for the garage, I installed a new lock. Reinforced steel. No backup key floating around. Just one copy. Mine. Let them try again. The week after Beverly's removal from the HOA board was the quietest Moss Ridge Estates had ever been. No violation notices, no early morning property surveys, no one circling the block in SUVs with clipboards. For the first time since I moved in, people actually waved to each other without glancing over their shoulders. But peace, as it turned out, was temporary. It started with a city inspector knocking on my door. He was a tall guy, maybe in his late 40s, with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a badge clipped to his belt. Not City Police Building and Safety Division. He introduced himself as Inspector Halvorsen and said he was there to follow up on a report about unsafe storage of chemicals in a residential garage. I stared at him for a second. What chemicals? He checked the clipboard, flipped a few pages, then read aloud. Improper handling of flammable solvents, unsecured propane tanks, and suspected pesticide violations. Report submitted under the city's Hazard Watch initiative. I didn't even own a propane tank. I let him into the garage. It was spotless. I'd scrubbed every inch after the skunk incident, even replaced the shelving with sealed bins and labeled containers. Everything was either locked up or fully compliant. Halvorsen took one look around and rubbed his jaw. This doesn't match the report, he said. Who submitted it? He hesitated for a moment, then showed me the form. The name wasn't Beverly's. It was someone named Ronnie Wilkes. I didn't recognize it. But the address listed was familiar, one of the former board members who had resigned alongside Beverly. I thanked Halvorsen for being professional, and he left with a vague promise to close the complaint. But something about the whole thing gnawed at me. This wasn't just petty revenge. It was methodical, coordinated. That night I called Martin. She's not done, I said. She's just gone underground. Martin agreed. He'd been digging into the HOA's finances even after the recall vote, and he'd found something disturbing. Several wire transfers from the HOA's reserve account had gone out in the days leading up to the board's removal, totaling over $8,000. The records listed them as consulting fees and enforcement services, but there were no invoices, no contracts, no justification. She funneled money to someone, Martin said. Probably to keep causing trouble while she lays low. I asked him if he could trace it. Already started, he said. But if this goes where I think it does, we'll need more than just a paper trail. We need to catch someone in the act. That didn't take long. 2 days later, the elderly neighbor who Beverly had fined for the bird feeder called me in a panic. Someone had broken into her shed. Nothing was stolen, but her gardening tools were scattered, her bags of soil slashed open, and a bright orange sticker had been slapped on the inside wall. Unauthorized structure subject to removal per HOA guidelines. She didn't even have an HOA anymore. I checked my security cameras for the night before, and sure enough, a figure had walked right past my driveway around 2 in the morning, hood up, gloves on, carrying a duffel bag. They headed in the direction of May's backyard. I enhanced the footage, passed it to Martin, and he forwarded it to Officer Torres, the same guy who had taken the vandalism report after the spray painting. Within 24 hours, Torres got back to us. You're not going to believe this, he said, sliding a photo across Martin's desk. We matched the gate and billed from your footage to a guy named Curtis Vallon. He's got a record misdemeanor trespass, impersonating a city employee, couple of sketchy contractor complaints. But here's the kicker, he was paid directly from the HOA account 3 days before the vote. I stared at the photo. Curtis was greasy looking, with a patchy beard and eyes that didn't seem to focus on anything. He looked like the type who'd install a fence with no posts and vanish before the concrete dried. He's Beverly's muscle, Torres said. Or was. Martin leaned forward, lowering his voice. If she's hiring guys like this to break into sheds and stage code violations, she's crossed into criminal conspiracy territory. We filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. Martin compiled every financial record, every incident report, every camera still and timestamp. Meanwhile, Torres brought in Curtis for questioning. He cracked in under an hour. According to his statement, Beverly had hired him to keep the neighborhood in line after the board was booted. She'd promised him a series of bonuses for every citation he could manufacture, a broken gate here, a misaligned trash bin there. She'd even given him a list of targets, most of them residents who had signed the petition to remove her. The DA didn't wait long. Within 72 hours, they issued a warrant for Beverly's arrest on charges of criminal mischief, conspiracy to commit fraud, misuse of HOA funds, and multiple counts of unlawful surveillance. She was picked up at a rental cabin 2 towns over, where she'd been staying under her sister's name. The news hit the local papers by the next morning. Headline: Former HOA president arrested in neighborhood harassment scheme. The article detailed everything: the skunk incident, the fake citations, the surveillance, the shell payments. The final paragraph quoted the DA directly. This was not just a case of overzealous enforcement. This was a coordinated effort to manipulate, intimidate, and defraud a community for personal control. Beverly's mugshot was all over the internet before noon. Sunglasses off this time, hair a tangled mess, her face a maze of disbelief and fury. But even as she sat in county jail awaiting arraignment, the damage she'd done still rippled through the neighborhood. Ronnie Wilkes, the board member who had filed the fake chemical report, tried to deny his involvement until his home was searched and they found printed maps of the subdivision with red X's on certain houses. My house, Mays Martin's. Each had notes scrawled next to them: watch front yard, trash violation, check for unauthorized pets. The city launched an official audit of every violation the HOA had issued in the past year. Over 100 were flagged as potentially fabricated. Fines were refunded. In some cases, residents were issued formal apologies from the city code department, which had unknowingly acted on fake reports. Martin pushed for a civil suit not just against Beverly, but against the HOA itself as a legal entity. With enough signatures, we could argue that the board had operated under fraudulent leadership, and residents who had suffered financial or emotional harm could seek restitution. By the time the community meeting was held to vote on the lawsuit, the clubhouse was standing room only. Residents shared stories about being fined for window blinds, about having to remove porch swings, about being watched through binoculars from across the street. The vote passed unanimously, but the moment that stayed with me happened as the meeting was wrapping up. May, soft-spoken as ever, stood up with a folded piece of paper in her hand. She said she'd found it taped to her back door the morning after her shed was vandalized. It was a note from Beverly, a final warning. It read, "You can strip a title, but not authority. I built this neighborhood. You'll see what happens when you forget that." Martin took the note. He didn't say anything, just passed it to the police. Beverly's trial was scheduled for the following month. The charges were severe enough that, if convicted, she could face several years behind bars. Curtis agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Ronnie was already scrambling to negotiate a plea deal. As for me, I replaced the garage door entirely. Steel-reinforced, new locking system, motion-activated lights. Not because I was afraid, just because I was done being a target. I installed 2 more cameras, one facing the street and one covering the side yard. Not paranoia, just preparation. The neighborhood changed after that. People came together not out of fear, but solidarity. We held block parties again. Kids played in sprinklers. No one got fined for having a hammock or a birdbath. The new interim board, made up of volunteers who actually lived here and cared, started working on a revised charter, one with clear boundaries, checks, and safeguards. Beverly may have tried to control the neighborhood, but in the end, she united it. Just not the way she wanted. The first court date arrived on a gray April morning, the kind where the clouds hang like a low ceiling and the whole world feels like it's holding its breath. I stood outside the courthouse with Martin and a handful of neighbors, all dressed like we were attending a funeral, except none of us were mourning. We were waiting to see Beverly finally face the consequences of what she'd done without the protection of a clipboard or the HOA's seal behind her. Inside, the courtroom was quiet but tense. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but waiting. The judge was a woman in her 60s with a razor-sharp voice and no patience for theatrics. Beverly sat at the defense table wearing a pale blouse with shoulder pads that made her look like a linebacker in mourning. Her new attorney, a city firm guy with slicked back hair and a tie that cost more than my monthly mortgage, kept whispering in her ear. Beverly didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge anyone. Just stared straight ahead like she was too proud to blink. The prosecution laid out the charges clearly. Misappropriation of HOA funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, trespassing with intent to intimidate, criminal vandalism, unlawful surveillance, witness intimidation. Each count backed by evidence, bank statements, surveillance footage, sworn testimony. No room for ambiguity. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Langston, was thorough without being showy. She didn't need drama. The facts did all the work. She presented the HOA's financial records alongside Curtis's taped confession, then moved straight into the illegally obtained footage recovered from Beverly's hard drives. When May took the stand, she held her printed bird feeder fine in her trembling hands. She never raised her voice, never cried. Just told the truth. When she finished, there wasn't a sound in the courtroom except the judge flipping a page in her notes. Beverly's attorney tried to paint her as someone who had been overwhelmed with responsibility and misguided in her efforts to preserve the integrity of the neighborhood. He even floated the idea that some of the more extreme actions like hiring Curtis were done without her knowledge. But when the court clerk pulled up a text exchange between her and Curtis, including a message that read, "Make him regret building that stupid garage fortress," the defense's momentum faltered. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. I described the first time I noticed my tools had been moved, the scratches on the lock, the footage of her entering with a copied key, the vandalism, the city inspector who'd been sent to investigate fake hazards. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't need to. Langston asked one final question before I stepped down. "Did you ever feel unsafe in your own home?" I thought about that for a moment. Thought about coming home late after a hospital shift and checking every door, every window. Listening for footsteps that didn't belong. Wondering if tonight was the night she'd escalate. "Yes," I said. Beverly didn't look at me once. The trial lasted 4 days. On the 5th, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all primary charges. Unanimous. When the judge read the sentence, 18 months in county jail, followed by court-mandated psychiatric evaluation and a 10-year ban from serving on any residential board or committee, Beverly finally reacted. She turned her head toward the gallery and scanned the faces, as if trying to find someone, anyone on her side. No one met her gaze. She was let out in cuffs. After the trial, the neighborhood didn't celebrate. There were no banners or block parties, no champagne toasts on porches. The mood was more like recovery than victory. People started planting again, fixing things they'd let fall into disrepair. The community board transitioned from interim to permanent with new bylaws written in plain language and posted publicly. No more hidden clauses, no more emergency powers without checks. Martin helped spearhead a neighborhood mediation initiative that connected people directly to city services for non-emergency issues. No more relying on a board with a God complex. If someone's fence needed fixing, volunteers helped. If a lawn got overgrown, a teenager with a mower and a flyer in the mailbox showed up the next afternoon. May's shed was rebuilt with help from 3 households, one of whom brought over fresh soil and potted daisies. I installed motion lights for her, this time wired to a solar battery that would keep them running through the worst outage. As for me, I kept the cameras, but I stopped checking them obsessively. I started sleeping without the baseball bat next to the bed. I even left the garage door open a few times while I worked on the old motorcycle that had been gathering dust for years. People walked by and waved. One kid asked if I could show him how to change a tire. Felix, the wildlife guy, sent me a postcard from Montana. Said he was starting a side business helping ranchers relocate coyotes, and that if I ever needed another midnight delivery, I knew who to call. I laughed and tacked the postcard to the inside of the new garage door. The civil lawsuit moved slowly, as they always do, but it gained traction. Enough residents joined the case that the HOA's insurance company eventually offered a settlement enough to reimburse every illegitimate fine, cover the cost of repairs for vandalism, and fund the creation of a resident-led oversight committee. Separate from the board. The last time I saw Beverly was 3 weeks before her sentencing. I had gone to the county records office to pick up a copy of the finalized HOA charter amendments, and she was sitting in the waiting area in civilian clothes, waiting to sign over power of attorney for her house apparently. She was moving in with a relative out of state. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not in stature, but in presence. The kind of person who had once filled every space she entered with tension, now reduced to a fading echo in a room full of strangers. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and just didn't want to acknowledge it. Either way, I walked past her without a word. Outside, the sun had finally come out. A broad, cloudless sky stretched over the city like a fresh page. I stood there for a while, the packet of documents tucked under my arm, and watched a group of kids race their bikes down the sidewalk, shouting and laughing like they had the whole world ahead of them. For the first time in a long while, I believed they did. And I believed we did too.